As for today, we will inform you about the aspects of art during the Romantic period, which started at the end of the 18th century with its peak between 1800 and 1850, as well as introduce you to some of the key philosophers of the same period. We will compare both the groups at the end of this video to give you an overview of how the key values of the Romantic period were applied to different aspects of society.
Art of the Romantic period is built on the changing values of the 19th century society. Emotion and sensation became of greater importance to the creation of the arts. As opposed to the Romantic arts, realism rose as a movement as well. We, however, will only examine the Romantic arts as part of our presentation and use the realists as an example of the growing number of branches in the art world. One major change was, in contrast to the Age of Enlightenment, the changing focus from the Classic period to the Middle Ages. This resulted in the Gothic revival in England, for example. These changes were the result of the industrialization and the urban growth that was brought forth by this development. It caused a feeling of distance. Civilians weren't as closely bound as they used to be, and nature wasn't an important factor in our lives. The Romantic artists tried to bring back the feeling of belonging to something bigger by changing the themes of their paintings. The arts were mainly divided between the academic artists, who followed strict rules in how art was to be created, and the landscape artists who started painting landscapes, where nature was the main subject, instead of being a background for historical and political themes. We will now introduce you to the following artists: John Constable, Eugène Delacroix, and Caspar David Friedrich. We will also tell you a bit about the French Salon and the Barbizon.
John Constable is an English painter who is widely known for his landscape paintings. His affinity with the values of the Romantic period can be found in one of his quotes: "Painting is but another word for feeling." His work gained a massive amount of attention in France and would inspire the Barbizon. Constable pursued a career and entered the Royal Academy schools as a probationer. During his education, he mainly focused on the old masters rather than finding his own style. This can be noted in his early artwork. In his early years as a painter, he did not make any romanticized paintings, but rather painted in a manner of simplicity, painting scenes of ordinary daily life. He later took up portraiture, however he didn't continue as he found it to be dull. Though his work was immensely popular abroad, he would only sell 20 pieces of artwork in his native England. Because, as to quote him, "I would rather be a poor man in England than to be a rich man abroad." One of his most well-known works is the Salisbury Cathedral from the Bishop's grounds. It is an oil painting from 1823 and depicts the medieval Cathedral of Salisbury. The work in the end results of a series of paintings Constable made of the cathedral, as requested by his friend John Fisher, who is also the Bishop of Salisbury. It is a great example of the embodiment of the values of the Romantic landscape painters, as it captures the atmospheric qualities of the weather in the back, as well as capturing the simplicity of life by depicting the cattle in the front.
The Salon was from 1748 to 1890 the greatest annual art event in Western Europe. The Salon was an art exhibition held by the French Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Here academic art was featured, fitting with the rules of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. In 1824, work of John Constable was exhibited. His landscapes, in which nature was the subject, inspired young painters to focus on this as well. After the revolutions of 1848, these young painters gathered to form the Barbizon School. The name of this group was given after their meeting place of Barbizon. This would be the start of the Realism movement. The Salon was from 1748 to 1890 the greatest annual art event in Western Europe. The Salon was an art exhibition held by the French Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Here academic art was featured, fitting with the rules of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. In 1824, work of John Constable was exhibited. His landscapes, in which nature was the subject, inspired young painters to focus on this as well. After the revolutions of 1848, these young painters gathered to form the Barbizon School. The name of this group was given after their meeting place of Barbizon. This would be the start of the Realism movement.
Eugene Delacroix was a French painter who had a profound influence on the Romantic movement. He was known as the master of color. He received many commissions from the government. His violent subject matter, intense passion, and bright colors puzzled and offended some contemporary critics, but earned the admiration of others. His paintings and his technique had a lasting impact on the art world. He got mostly influenced by the Moroccan culture. It was so different to the French. The brightly colored, flowing costumes, the Arabs and their women, and the enchanting horses. Delacroix used Arab subjects in his work for the remainder of his life. An example in which his choice for violent subjects is greatly displayed is the Massacre at Chios. The oil painting was displayed at the Salon in 1824 and shows the Chios massacre, which was the killing of tens of thousands of inhabitants of the Greek island of Chios during the Greek War of Independence of 1822. These killings by the Ottomans led to international outrage. The painting shows a dramatic image of victims of the hands of the Ottoman troops, composed in two triangles. A triangular composition is key in the traditional arts.
Caspar David Friedrich was a German landscape painter and is considered the most important German artist of his generation. His landscapes, which mostly feature silhouetted figures against the night sky or morning mist, were considered as one of the best at the time. In the 1930s, his work was used to promote Nazi ideology. He tried to put his work into the nationalistic blood and bodem. This meant a huge decline in his popularity. A famous example of his work is the Abbey in the Oakwood. As you can see, the artwork is quite dark, though it feels serene. It is likely he chose for a darker depiction as it was inspired by the ruins of Eldena Abbey. This was a monastery which was destroyed by the Protestant Swedish troops in the 30 Years' War. A war from 1618 to 1648 in which Catholics and Protestants fought each other in Central Europe. Note that Friedrich was raised in a strict Lutheran family. Bare oak trees like those in this painting were a recurring theme as he used them to symbolize death. It might not be easy to immediately tell what's going on in this painting, but if you look on the bottom you will see a procession of monks entering the ruins while carrying a coffin. On the front you can see several crosses as well, which he used to symbolize redemption. Like in many paintings, it shows the setting sun. This would later in his life continue to be a great element of his work and a sign of his growing pessimism. Friedrich is an example of an artist incorporating religion into their art in a new fashion.
Philosophy in the 19th century was heavily influenced by the sciences and had a great focus on politics. People wanted to see change in their society. Many philosophers held a negative view on the world. The most prominent tendencies from this period are idealism, utilitarianism, Marxism, existentialism, positivism, pragmatism, and transcendentalism, with idealism being split in two separate groups, German idealism and English idealism. Many philosophers of the idealistic and transcendentalist movements were inspired by Immanuel Kant, a key philosopher of the period of Enlightenment. Next, we will discuss a few of the philosophers affiliated with the referred tendencies. We will give you some insight to Marxism, German idealism, utilitarianism, as these are the affiliated tendencies of the philosophers we will discuss today. We will give you an introduction to Immanuel Kant, who, as you might know, is actually a philosopher from the Age of Enlightenment. However, as he has impacted philosophy so greatly of his period, we ought it to be important for you to know a little more about him. We will also be discussing John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Engels, of course Karl Marx, and at last Johann Gottlieb Fichte.
Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher. He was one of the most important philosophers of the 18th century. Kant built upon the work of many empiricists and rationalists. He made a strong distinction between these two groups. Immanuel Kant is the person that founded the Kantian philosophy. The Kantian ethics are revolving around duty rather than emotions and goals. Kant's ethics are founded on his view of rationality as the ultimate good and his belief that all people are fundamentally rational beings. This led to the most important part of Kant's ethics, the formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the criterion for whether a maxim is good or bad. The people that Immanuel Kant got his inspiration from were David Hume, René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, George Berkeley, John Locke, David Hume, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and Christian Wolff. Kant has had a wide influence with major political philosophers of the late 20th century. For example, John Rawls drew his inspiration heavily out of the basis of Kantianism.
John Stuart Mill was a utilitarianist, which means he believed that the purpose of morality was making life better by increasing the amount of pleasure and happiness, and decreasing the amount of pain and unhappiness in the world. His theories would have a great impact on the later economics and politics. His greatest influence came from the philosopher Bentham, who laid the pathway to utilitarianism. Contrary to early utilitarianists, Mill wrote about the importance of individual rights and the importance of women's rights. His analysis of inductive reasoning and causation remains a point of discussion to this day. His views, however, on the possibility of scientific explanation of the social events caused uproar among so-called intuitionists, who in simple terms believed that the universe was a creation governed by a deity, a god. Despite being known for his agnostic views, in a book, 3 Essays on Religion, which was published after his death, he stated that though a divine force might not be present, there is some kind of force at work in the world. His views on women's rights were radical for his time, especially coming from men. His book, The Subjection of Women, is one of the earliest accounts of writing on this subject by a male author. He called women slaves on multiple accounts and suggested that marriage was one of the things hindering women in their lives.
Karl Marx was a philosopher, economist, political theorist, sociologist, journalist, and revolutionary socialist, and was the founder of Marxism and is considered the father of communism. He was strongly influenced by Immanuel Kant, and he became stateless as adult and died a stateless man in the end. He was the person that wrote the Communist Manifesto and called all proletarians to unite. He wrote this with his best friend and the person that helped him throughout his life, Friedrich Engels. Marx's theory about society, economics, and politics, named Marxism, hold that human society developed through class struggle. The upper classes controlled the working classes, named the proletariat. Marx predicted that these proletarian workers would turn up against their bosses and leading away to political power. Marx was the founder of communism, a political ideology that seeks to establish a future without social class or formalized state structure. The proletarian revolution set back many countries, which is clearly shown in the next quote. The same was manifested in the American Civil War, where economic development was thrown back for a decade. In the proletarian revolution, the same thing takes place on a much larger scale. During a proletarian revolution, we must not only destroy the state machine, but completely reorganize the industrial relations. That is the most important part. Johann Gottlieb Fichte was a German philosopher who gained a lot of appreciation with his insights about self-consciousness and self-awareness. Fichte wrote the line, "The living and efficaciously acting moral order is itself God. We require no other God, nor can we grasp any other." No one else had denied the existence of God in such a way, and he had to leave his hometown. Fichte was the founder of the philosophical movement known as German idealism, which developed from the theoretical and ethical writings from Immanuel Kant.
One of the most notable differences between the two discussed groups is their attitude. Whereas the artists often had a rather positive outlook and focused on the mystic and unknown, the philosophers had a great critical outlook and phrased their thoughts in harsh writings, stating the facts as they were and how society was ought to change them, though many artists started incorporating anti-government elements into their artwork as well, often in a non-subtle manner. In both groups, individualism became less favored as opposed to the mentality of the key figures in the Age of Enlightenment. Many philosophers from this period denied the existence of a god completely. The artists, however, kept a more often moderate view on religion. They sought God in nature and beauty rather than in all things evil. The role of God was altered throughout a great part of the 19th century. We have now seen that the extent of it differs between different social groups. A significant similarity between the idealist and the romantic artist is the focus on nature. The landscape painters started painting in the open sky, and out of German idealism grew the so-called nature philosophy, which would have a great impact on the developments among the sciences. The rise of nationalism would also impact both groups in the realization. Many pleaded for change. The artists for a reform within society, the philosophers for a reform of society. The goal was the same for these groups, an improvement of society as a whole, but as we have seen, the differences can be found in their approach. We are happy to have informed you about the diverse aspects of Romanticism, and we hope to have given you some new insights as well. With this we conclude our presentation. We thank you for listening.